Hello, and welcome to Locutors of Trek, the podcast where we talk about the people, places, and things of Star Trek. So, replicate yourself a Romulan ale or your synth selection of choice, and join us far beyond the stars.
Locutors of Trek.
Program initiated. Enter when ready.
Well, hi there. Welcome back. It's Dave.
And I'm Davin.
And we are Locutors of Trek.
And Plain Simple Tailors.
And tonight our topic is to be economics in the future, how it might reflect or allow us to comment on some imperatives and directions in our own time, and maybe imagine possible futures and how they might work at the level of day-to-day practicalities.
Direction unclear.
Well, to begin with, let's do a bit of etymology right off the top. Economics comes from the Greek oikos and nomos, or oikonomikos. And oikos meaning...
That's how I pronounce it.
The household itself. And it's always important to remember that the Greeks had a very direct understanding of the fact that the physical structure of a thing could be quite different than its functions. So, for instance, they had a word astu for the physical structure, the buildings and streets and things of a city, but polis was the city itself, and that's where we get political from. So here, oikos, as opposed to being one piece of the astu, the oikos is the house, more like in the sense that we would be familiar with in like House Stark or House Targaryen or House Harkonnen or Atreides. That sense of a house as a family, an organism, a kind of almost a natural corporation, a body in that sense, politic or economic in this sense, right? Mm-hmm. And so the word oikos is from house or home, family, and nomos is for...
The House of Quark.
The House of Quark, exactly. House of Moog, House of... yeah, exactly. Whereas Cisco buys a house on Bajor.
He does.
And how he does that will be an interesting question.
We'll definitely talk about how he does that. And perhaps in somewhat more modern terms, John Maynard Keynes coined the economic problem, which exists because although the needs and wants of people are endless, the resources available to satisfy needs and wants are limited. So there's an inherent problem perceived to exist.
Right.
Now, we'll get into how Star Trek tackles that problem, because it is indeed a pretty good assessment of economics as we know it. Once a product loses its scarcity, it loses its value as well. And kind of
certainly in terms of a market of commodities exchange, right? And that always relies on what, another great economist would ultimately derive as the general formula for capital. And I'm talking about my dear old friend, Karl Marx, who...
Dave's favorite dead friend.
One of them, for sure. Certainly one of my favorite dead friends from the 19th century. So the formula of capital in this sense, which Marx gives us as a way to analyze the movement of capital as a force, right? Because the first volume of Capital is essentially an analysis of how this thing works, like what it does, how it behaves, in a sort of scientific fashion as it can manage, right? So the general formula is what we call MCM prime. So that would be the purchase, M, of the commodity of labor power, C, and its transformation thereby into surplus value, M prime. That is used and redistributed ultimately by the capitalist in our system. That surplus value is ultimately the question, right? And the economic problem in this sense, as Keynes would put it, would ultimately apply after we dealt with the other necessities of society to that subset of excess or surplus value as well, I think in a more specific sense. But Keynes' problem, of course, is attempting to define the ground of economic activity as such, which is that disparity between consumption or desire and need and resource.
I think maybe this episode can double as our second politics episode as Dave tries to take the communist approach to the Star Trek, the economics of Star Trek, Trekonomics, if you will. And I more take I just sat through the audiobook Trekonomics by Manu Sadia twice in preparation for this episode. And he takes the stance that the Federation is a successful social democracy post-scarcity.
Right.
Most of what I'm going to say in this episode is probably going to be informed by the book Trekonomics, which it's not going to cover all of it, so everybody should definitely read that book if they enjoy this episode.
But in my understanding is what he's saying is that they're going to chart a course that's neither capitalist nor communist.
Yes.
Essentially, it's
Yes.
some new political order that we don't even really have.
Well,
that we've only just imagined, maybe.
we're going to get into that.
Yeah, let's do it.
But
let's do it.
We're not going to start there, Dave. We have to start on equal footing, at least as equal as we can make it.
Well, let's try.
Because you may, and I'm sure you do, know a great deal about human economics. And human economics are, how should I put it, quaint.
I think I see where you're going with this.
But as you know, I spent 2 semesters at the Ferengi School of Business.
I've heard a lot about those lobes.
I mean, I hope it's not immodest to say that Ferengi economics are like, oh geez, compared to human in Federation, human economics, if you will. I mean, that's like comparing a jetliner to a rock rolling down a hill, isn't it?
Well, I think even the depth of history of Ferengi economics as it's presented in Star Trek dwarfs that of any continuous human economic system. I think that just has to be admitted right out of the gate. They've had essentially the same economic system for what, 9 or 10,000 years? Something like that?
Something like that. I think it's time for our second lesson in my semi-regular course.
All right, let's do it.
Avoiding Eternal Destitution for Hoomans. Such as yourself, Dave.
Such as I am a Hooman.
What you are about to hear is the most beautiful sound in the galaxy.
So this lesson will also be a Ferengi ancient history course, which you may find interesting.
Ooh,
Now, did you know, Dave, the Ferengi did not always look the way they look as we see them in Deep Space Nine, for example?
How did they look otherwise?
They were very tall, very perfect of complexion.
Okay.
Beautiful mane of feathers.
Feathers.
Head of tail. They were the envy of all other creatures because of their beauty. Now, that may seem strange to you, but there was another race on Ferenginar back in the ancient days called the Gree.
Okay.
Now, they were very, very tall. Large talons, poison-tipped spikes sticking out of the top of their heads. Very strong. Millennia of war between these two species over who gets to dominate Ferenginar. You know, war, competition.
Now, is this an evolutionary history, or are they considering themselves sentient at this point?
Oh, no, this is...
In their sentient history?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Absolutely.
That's I didn't know how far back we were reaching here.
Not that far back.
Okay.
Because the Blessed Exchequer, as you may have heard of.
I've heard.
Yeah. Visited the Ferengi and the Gree and said, we must stop this war and this competition. It's highly unprofitable. So you two can bid to see who gets to rule Ferenginar. And they had to bid parts of themselves. So first off, the Ferengi's just like, well, you can take our height. That's fine. And then the Gree were like, well, you can take our poison-tipped barbs.
That's a good starting offer, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, what do you need those for?
Because they're tiny. We'll just squish them. Right?
Fair enough. You're
thinking like a Gree here.
You're almost you may be thinking like a Ferengi as you'll see in a minute. So
Well, maybe. That'd be lucky.
the Ferengi then bid their perfect complexion. And then the Gree followed that up, well, you can take our talents. And then the Ferengi followed up, take our beautiful mane. And then the Gree said, well, you can take whatever you need. You know, their size, their talons, their strength, everything. But in a desperate bid at the end. And Blessed Exchequer says, that's fine, that's great. You can rule Ferenginar. And but all they were at the end of that is a small worm-like creature with teeth. Now, you may have heard of the Ferengi delicacy.
I have.
Razor-toothed Gree worms.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
The Gree ruled Ferenginar for about 2 or 3 weeks. That's how long it took for the Ferengi to devour all of the Gree. And as you've heard Rom say about razor-toothed reworms, they may be succulent, but sometimes they bite back.
That's true.
Now, why I tell you this story, Dave, is there's an important lesson at the root of that, which is never pay more for an acquisition than you have to.
Wow.
Third rule of acquisition.
Beautiful wisdom right there. What a gorgeous piece of mythology.
And
Now-
and culinary. There's so much going on in
Also
that
culinary
story.
too. It's true. It's like one of those beautiful just so tales. So now here's the other question, which may be totally non-opposite to the
Hold
inquiry.
on. Questions to the floor.
Thank you.
there.
Dave Puxley, Locutors of Trek.
Yep.
So, does this have anything to do with why the Ferengi file their teeth as well?
Oh, they had perfect teeth too. They had to bit.
Oh, the teeth grow in that way naturally, eh? I wondered if they filed the teeth to those points in like a sort of historic imitation of
No,
the
they had
mealworm.
perfectly straight
Or maybe
teeth.
to bite
They were
them
very
easier.
beautiful.
I see.
There was a longer bidding process than I got into, but
Well, I suppose they're depending on the
suffice it
version
to say,
of the
the
tale.
Gree made it down to worm size, so there was a lot of bidding going on.
Yeah, that's a lot to bid away.
You know, the origin of Ferengi as we know it, and Gree worms.
It all comes down to the third rule of acquisition.
Well, I think that concludes our lesson for today. I hope you've learned something and can apply that to your quaint notion of human economics.
I'll try anyway.
Well, let's talk about Trekonomics, shall we?
All right.
So-
Thank you for that lesson.
Not a problem, not a problem. It's always a pleasure teaching those who want to be taught.
Indeed. All existing things are interesting.
So yeah, like I said, Trekonomics by Manu Saadia. A very good book. Thanks, Manu. So most of the stuff I'm going to talk about is coming from that some form or another. I'm not going to go verbatim. It's just how I interpreted his book.
Sure. So I'm going to confess that I have not read the book in its entirety. In fact, I made it about 8 pages into the introduction. But I'm going to reply as just out of sort of my own amateur knowledge of economics and
Hooman.
Hooman economics. That's true. And yeah, just throw a comment in here or there. But I'm interested to see where we wander in
Dave's
this
pretty
voyage.
sharp for a Hooman, though.
Why, thank you.
No problem, Dave.
My teeth aren't very sharp, but I'll work on that.
Look, the busted exchequer might give you an opportunity to bid those away sometime. What do
You
you
never
really want?
know.
Do you want Earth? No. Why don't we talk about the origins of... We could, I'm going to say economics. I'm going to say Trekonomics sometimes.
Let's do it.
Trekonomics will be me referring to the economics of Star Trek.
Sure.
Short form Trekonomics, just like the book. Let's talk about the origins of Trek's economic view.
Sure.
Now,
Sure.
that would have its roots in utopian science fiction.
Sure.
But if we want to go even further back, we could talk about Plato's Republic, I think, is the beginning ember of what Star Trek.
There are a number of
envisions in
ways
our
in
future.
which the Republic is meditated upon in Star Trek. Particularly, they're interested in the problem of the philosopher king and what happens if your philosopher king has sort of one odd constitution or another. Sargon, in a certain sense, is one variety of that. The computer, which sends people to their disintegration on the 2 planets at war, is another version of this, I think. But yeah. In what sense is Saadia arguing about Plato for economic terms?
I guess as a precursor to Thomas More's Utopia,
Okay.
and then from that,
To this envisionment of a noble state, or what Plato would call the Kallipolis,
Yes.
the beautiful or noble
yes,
city.
which I believe he talked about in the Republic.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's the beginning of that idea that there can be this utopia. Mm-hmm. It's a potential future.
And interestingly, for a lovely enterprise nod, Plato at one point has, I think it might be Socrates, joke to Glaucon, who by this point, with his brother Adeimantus, has taken up the argument of the sophist Thrasymachus, that to really get this noble city going, what you really have to do is get rid of the adults and take the children and just raise them.
Yeah.
Shades of Sung taking the augment children away and raising them with his own beliefs, right? Or I suppose the captive Klingons in the Romulan prison planet would be another weird version of that as well. Anyway.
So from that, Thomas More's Utopia, a utopian vision of the future, very popular in its time.
Yeah, beautifully critical at the same time in this double-tongued way of present politics. There's an extended critique of Henry's policy of hanging robbers as being economically brutal, because it both makes people more desperate and it means that you remove potential healthy, clever, agile laborers from, or at least strong ones who can overpower somebody in that sense, from your workforce, who could otherwise be repurposed to some use that would benefit both you and them, which is a fascinating argument that the utopians sort of through Raphael Hitler end up making. What a great book. What a great period of writing.
And from that, perhaps more direct inspiration for the original Star Trek would be the books of Robert Heinlein.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Starship Troopers, Stranger in a Strange Land.
Oh, yeah. I assume some of the things in Foundation from Asimov as well are going to slide in there somewhere.
With, he invented the word positronic.
Oh, yeah. Well, true. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. That's Daniel Olivaw's brain, isn't it?
And very much with automation picking up all the slack for mankind. Asimov's just like, we can have robots, we can have automation, and then human labor is not a commodity anymore.
Well, essentially, Data has Asimov's laws of robotics built into him, in the sense that he's programmed to resist hurting anything unless it directly threatens his own existence or the existence of somebody else that he has to take care of. Right?
Yeah,
he's got a very interesting, complex set of robotic laws built in there.
Yeah, like he told Akivas Fajo, he's like, you've reached a point now where I will have to take lethal force against you.
Yeah.
I mean,
like,
it's hard to get to this point in my program.
Yeah, like you've really worked hard to get to here.
You're really the worst. Which we've discussed in another episode of
just the
worst.
Saul Rubinek, man.
You may not know this, Dave. Asimov actually consulted on TOS, and he addressed the first Star Trek convention.
Wow.
Yeah, they consulted him on their vision of the future a lot, I believe. And I think they wanted to keep it generally consistent with his. I think that was Gene's thing. I think he really looked up to Asimov's science fiction.
Well, Asimov's robot stories, they sort of portend a vision of the future in which much of our manual labor is taken care of by a high degree of automation, including these robots who take various forms, including humanoid.
I'm an android.
And develop for themselves their own form of sentience over time, which of course Roddenberry restricts to Data for really, I think, interesting dramatic effect. But, Data could easily have been his Daniel Oliva. And it'd be lovely to see a moment in which Lore might come back and have a redemption for that. Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah.
Or maybe we can see another
season 3 Lore.
Exactly. Or another android from Coppelius might be able to perform that role admirably. You never know. But yeah, he really does, particularly in some of the mystery and robot detective novels, portray these worlds in which some things are taken to excess. Worlds in which humans rarely have contact with each other except in order to procreate because they're so worried about each other's, germs and things. But by and large, the worlds that humanity inhabits are essentially techno paradises, where most of the needs of daily life have been largely taken care of so that people can mostly do what they like. Now, that's different by the time the Foundation novels roll around.
Yeah.
But that is a very complex history related to the
two
detective.
Very much influenced Star Trek, those Foundation novels, for sure. I haven't read those personally, but Manu Sadia does get into that in Trekonomics.
Right on.
Now, it's interesting because economics and sci-fi do have a similarity, which is they're both concerned with change and speculation of the future.
Sure. Oh, that's a lovely thing. Yeah.
This is going to be an interesting episode. I think what we should do at the end of this episode, Dave, is once we've discussed all of the Trekonomics we can think of, ask ourselves if we think we can get there
Oh, yeah.
as a human species. Now, what Manu Saadia sort of posits in his book, and he makes a pretty convincing argument. Now, I'm gonna try to lead you there, Dave.
Okay.
I'm hoping by
Take
the
me to
end
the
you're gonna
promised
see
land.
me here. It's a very positive book. By the end of this book, you believe we can get there, even without replicators. That's the trick. Can we get there without replicators? Because if we have replicators, yes, we can.
Oh, yeah. The
We can
replicator
get rid of all.
is a game changer.
We can just satiate everything's satiated.
Yep.
Economics is gone.
Easily with the ability to turn energy into matter, and the way in which energy is contained in its very density and particle. I mean, it would be
So a bit of the theses we have to work on here is, can we get there without replicators? But we're going to talk about replicators. But that's where we're going here, Dave.
Right on.
And what is posited in Trekonomics is that not only is the Star Trek future possible, but it's almost, of all of the sci-fi we've seen, like, your Terminator, your Blade Runner, things more dystopian or certainly less optimistic.
Sure. Yeah. Profoundly less optimistic.
Yes. But the Star Trek future is also the most business as usual. That if continuing on the path that humanity has been on for the last 14,000 years, let's say,
It's an interesting
it's
thesis.
actually more likely to lead to the Star Trek future than to, say, the Terminator future. Or,
So the Terminator future would be an aberrant, dystopic possibility.
well, yes, and almost that the more computer science and technological view of the future is that computer processing will get to that point of a singularity.
And the replicator certainly is a beautiful embodiment of the notion of the singularity.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it?
Because you're right, I could see a moment in which, when the replicator comes into existence, because we know there's a couple of great short treks early on and a couple of great early Discovery episodes, as well as a number of original series episodes, which make it quite clear they have no replicator technology in the 23rd century. They've got none of that. They have highly sophisticated fabrication technology. They do a lot of stuff in space. All that sort of stuff.
Bring their food.
Exactly.
I just watched an episode of
They need to bring their food, or they need to bring.
He's like, we have enough food for 420 people for 5 years.
Yeah. And some of that is the protein that they can turn into those cubes that you see sometimes, but a lot of it
They probably
would
have
be,
big freezers, or
I'm
it's
sure.
all
And we see
freeze-dried,
the
and they have
original,
good methods of rehydrating.
Yeah.
Or
NX-01 has a full kitchen in it.
they have a chef
And a
with
chef.
fresh veggies. I'll tell you that much.
And I'm assuming they also have free-dried MREs and all sorts of other stuff too, right? And we see those used many times in Trek across a number of series.
The farthest back I think we've seen in Earth's timeline in Star Trek, as it relates to economics, which is Past Tense, which is an episode we've talked about before because it's fantastic.
And that is set in 2024, 2022, something like that.
Yes.
So we're not far off, folks.
Just before the Third World War.
Just after the eugenics wars and some other stuff. And a massive disease and accompanying economic collapse had promoted and produced the process of these sanctuary districts in the United States and other responses around the world.
Yeah.
Which is chillingly
Some
prescient.
people have found a way to live a wonderful life
Despite that, yes.
on the backs of.
The inequality of that situation is profound. The disparity that we see inside the sanctuary district, and then the experience that Jadzia has outside it are really starkly opposed to each other.
In that episode shows the Bell Riots.
Yeah.
Which is the catalyst that kind of set forth, as Tom Paris calls it, the New World Economy. Is what it was called. It's kind of like the New Deal.
Yeah.
But it's the New World Economy. And that was about in the 22nd century.
So we
never
have the
really heard
Third
any
World War
specifics
between
of that. We don't really. Yes.
And we have meeting the Vulcans between that as
Yeah.
well. So there's a number, the Bell Riots, the development of warp drive, meeting the Vulcans. But, there's 40 years between the Bell Riots and First Contact date, right? So there's a long time in which the world collapses into war on the basis of either trying to preserve that old crumbling order or produce some new one.
What would first contact with the Vulcans, or at least the aftermath of it, been like had the humans not achieved the New World economy?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, it was crippled, of course, by World War III.
Exactly.
But humanity at one point found a way to solve a lot of its problems.
And, the will was there. I think what we can see in the history is the will was there even before the way was discovered.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important because in a certain sense,
Yeah.
our economics are driven by will. What is it? What is the form of life we wish to have? What is it that we find ourselves desirous of in our lives? A lot of that's informed by our cultural situation and our values, right? So the having the impetus or the cultural will to do it, even if you end up beating yourselves to pieces in order to figure out how,
Hopefully,
it's
we
very
can
often
avoid World War III and the eugenics war.
Yeah, let's hope so.
But we're going to get into eugenics in a bit too.
Ooh.
This is going to be a thick episode, I think.
Yeah, man.
Thank you, Trekonomics.
Indeed. Thank you again, Manu Sadia.
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting you say that, Dave, how the change in people, that has to make this Trek future happen. As much as a change in economics.
Yeah.
And
because, Cochrane doesn't go up without that hope in his heart.
No. And
I don't think. Otherwise, he stays a drunk who can't make the technology work.
Yeah. Trekonomics makes the
he's so
interesting
depressed and
point about the original series. That Kirk is humanity now, essentially. Or at least how we see our more modern...
He certainly was a swinging 60s man in that sense.
Yeah, a more modern heroic figure where he just has a veneer of civilization, but he's an emotional and hormonal...
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of John McClane in Kirk, and a lot of Kirk and John McClane. For sure.
Sure. Merry Christmas. Yeah.
Yippee-ki-yay.
But it's interesting because you have that triumvirate of main characters on TOS. You have your Kirk, Spock, McCoy. They're the three main characters.
Absolutely.
Kirk is that relatable figure as we see kind of heroic figures now. McCoy is the transitional figure. He's empathetic. He's, emotionally intelligent.
Sure.
But also rational.
And sharply critical of what he sees to be
Yes.
faulty situations as well. I can see that. The
And-
kind of voice of critique.
And Spock is the end game of that, where he's how Roddenberry saw humanity evolving to.
Right.
He's stoic, he's rational, logical.
And in that sense, there's
And
a
in
deeply there's a deeply Platonic dimension to that as well, right? Because Plato in the Republic will argue that just as the city itself is the soul writ large, that because the essential question of the Republic begins at this festival to the goddess Bendis, who's coming to the city from the east. I think a Persian goddess originally, and the question is whether it's better to be just or unjust in this life. And that's the essential question, right? And so, to me, the argument Plato develops there that is about the way the city is governed, he also makes opposite to an argument about the government of the self.
And I find that very interesting as a time in Starfleet history, where we have those three types of figures all existing together, because the book makes the point that in TNG, the entire crew is Spock.
That's what they're supposed to be, absolutely, yeah. And, we even see...
Because that's a more advanced Federation humanity.
And it positions itself as literally the next generation along, in that sense, that we're the next step of what the Federation is going to be. And we hear in both comics forms and in films and other places that Kirk and his compatriots talk about money frequently.
Yep.
In the sense they talk about
get paid
buying.
in Federation credits. They have a salary.
Exactly. They get a salary, and they draw that when they return often enough.
Yep.
Because they don't have much use for it when they're out. By the time we get to the 24th century, the Federation credit is absolutely a notional value, which essentially is used because, and I think maybe this is where the argument is going, because of the replicator. The credit ceases to have any practical day-to-day value. You don't need to buy anything. When Beverly Crusher goes to buy something on Farpoint Station, that is her engaging in a quaint economic ritual.
Now, where the
And
Federation
that the Federation is going to pay for, no worries. But
yes,
she doesn't worry about money.
no. Where
She
the
has a
Federation
functionally
credit
infinite
could
wealth.
still have value is one with the Bank of Boleus. Apparently, the Federation does a lot of work with the Bank of Boleus. The Bank of Boleus is the main place where Starfleet, the Federation, exchanges whatever they have for things they can use with other people.
Oh, okay.
So you may have heard of the
So
Bank
they're a
of
commodities
Boleus.
exchange,
Like
essentially.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Because the Bolians are still only semi-Federation.
Are they Federation members, or do they just have an awful lot of Bolians join Starfleet and live inside the Federation?
There's a lot of Bolian planets, and some of them are on board, and some of them aren't.
Okay. Okay.
So
Because
Bolians-
we don't actually hear much about the organization of Bolian society.
No, but they're
just
not
that their
all in
body
as a
fluids are so
society.
caustic, they have to have their own quarters.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And they don't interdate too often.
No, that's apparently very challenging for them.
Even for Jadzia.
Yeah. Yeah. I think she'd go to dinner with a Bolian, but maybe not beyond that. You never know.
I don't like Captain Boudet.
That kills me every time.
Just seems like a real tiring kind of fella. You know?
I do not like Captain Boudet.
I do not like Captain Boudet.
Oh my. He gets so much grief on this show.
One day we will see Captain Boudet. That's what I heard.
One way we'll have to have an interview with him and apologize profusely while his brain visibly pulsates in anger.
Sorry, Boudet. I can see that you're angry.
Yeah, his brain is rainbow. Oh my.
So yes, as you mentioned with the credits,
Yeah.
the economics of the TOS era is very different than the economics of the TNG era.
Yeah, absolutely.
But where the credits, I think, maybe could persist is the Federation. They're probably the largest bondholders in the entire galaxy.
Well, they certainly have such a huge spread of planets that they could sustain a huge amount of lending, I would imagine.
The interest rate on the Federation would have to be 0 because there's no risk of them ever defaulting on anything.
You'd think so.
Their resources are too vast with so many planets involved and them all working together. So it's posited that
They'd
the
essentially have a kind of
Federation
bartering economy
actually
with
do
other...
rule galactic economics.
I could
It's
see
not
that.
the Ferengi, it's not the Orions, it's actually the Federation.
Well, why do the Ferengi
those-
want to be in the Federation so bad? Like
Whoa,
inside, not
whoa, what?
not members
Did
of the
you say,
Federation.
Dave?
Not members of the Federation, but why do they want to be inside Federation space so badly?
Yeah,
You see what I mean?
it's profitable.
Yeah, exactly. There's huge profit to be made.
So much money, for lack of a better word, at this point in the podcast,
Yeah,
being thrown around.
but essentially, so
So much wealth.
the concentration, the thickness of the current of the great material continuum there for a Ferengi would, I feel, just be like metaphorically, symbolically, emotionally, greed-wise, irresistible for them. Like it would just be, I think they'd have to resist the Federation on principle in order not to do business there.
Well put, Dave. You're getting a gold star, actually.
Oh, thank you. Worthless gold.
Worthless gold. Whoever decided to encase the Latin in worthless gold.
That's one of my favorite
But he was
moments.
smart enough to know it had value on Earth when they were
Yep.
trapped on Earth. And he
That's
was like,
for
gold
sure.
is good. Yep.
Gold's
So
essentially an electronics component for them, I think, and that's about it.
what we are really talking about with Trekonomics is a post-scarcity world.
Yeah.
And
And that's hard to envision right now.
ugh,
We have both enforced versions of scarcity and actual versions of scarcity operating in our world all the time for various economic purposes. And I think we have a very difficult time imagining from a single planetary perspective, but every planet in our solar system, if we don't find pre-existing life and we manage to respect something like a prime directive, which we probably won't at first, but that's all. Like the entire solar system is an economic gold mine, essentially. Quadrillions of dollars in minerals and single asteroids, and then that's just the core of a solar system.
yeah.
You think about the structure of an actual solar system, the space in which we imagine. Here's the solar system: the sun and the 8 planets, and then the many possible, dwarf and other proto and quasi planets out there. That's about between 1% and 5% of the entire volume of the solar system. Outside of that is an Oort cloud.
Yeah, if we need
we
rocks,
theorize.
there's basically an endless amount just in our neighborhood.
Just in our neighborhood, right? And then you think, how
Like, where do
many...
they build all these starships? It's like, that's...
Right, there's 185 or something member worlds in the Federation in the time of TNG, and the span of the Federation from coreward to rimward would be about 8,000 light years, and from side to side, it covers, I think, nearly 1,000. It's just massive. And the number of member worlds, colonies, mineable planets, asteroid fields, gas nebulas, it's just, once you get out there, the resources are functionally endless.
The size is amazing.
They drive through space. Those
we've
red
had-
things on the front of their spaceships, the Bizarre Collectors, literally just drive through space on the spare hydrogen in the universe. You know?
We've had radio, so we've been projecting radio waves into the universe for about 100 years, say.
Yeah.
It's...
They might have
I
reached
believe it's
Kronos
been
by now.
estimated that the closest possible system with intelligent life or life, for example, is about 80 light years away.
Yeah, somewhere between 40 and 80, something like that.
So if
Depends on what Anton Petrov has said this week.
shout
Hello,
out to
wonderful
Anton.
person. Indeed. Shout out to Anton Petrov.
You're a wonderful person, Anton.
Indeed.
Friend of the show, not yet, but
We'll consider
we should
him
have
a
Anton
friend
on the show. I wonder if he likes Star
In
Trek.
advance. I'll
Anton,
bet he
do you
does like Star
We're
Trek.
gonna
I hope he
We're
does.
going to talk. If there was intelligent life within intelligent life range,
Yeah.
and they've heard us, there hasn't been enough time for their message to get back to us yet.
No, there has not. Nope.
So that's one thing to consider when considering the Fermi paradox.
if it's
just
a light speed
there could be life
transmission.
there, but it's just like we're waiting. Give it a minute.
Yeah.
Give it a minute.
Exactly. It's a really long string we have tied to the end of that can.
Yeah. Exactly.
And we, they
That's
might
just
be
the
able
closest
they
one.
might be able to send a subspace message, but we sure as
How are we
anything
going to
can't
receive
hear
it?
it.
Yeah. What would it sound like? It would just
Exactly.
go by us.
What is that modem noise in the sky? What's going on?
Wouldn't it be funny if that's what it sounds like?
Oh yeah, man.
For all you locutors of Trek that didn't deal with dial-up, it was a magical time.
Indeed. You had to hear the magic noise in order to know the internet was happening. It was
And then
pretty
hear
exciting.
someone's voice come through it. Get off! I'm on the phone.
We only have 4 hours a month.
Yeah,
Oh yeah.
classic.
Yeah, indeed.
Dating
That was in a scarcity economy of digital information right
It
there.
really was. So yeah, we're talking about post-scarcity. Without replicators, it seems like the only realistic way for us to get there is like some sort of automation. We have to make human labor a non-commodity.
Yeah. And that essentially is
And
to return to
essentially,
my buddy for a
commodities
moment.
a non-commodity, that's tougher without the replicators.
In that respect, we have to tame capital. One of the challenges, I think,
Yeah.
of our time currently in history is looking at how we relate to capital. Because, my buddy I was talking about earlier, Marx, doesn't want to get rid of capital. He doesn't want to say it doesn't exist or that it in itself is bad. He wants to say that the current set of relationships that extract the surplus value created by the commodity of labor, which he gets from people like John Locke and other earlier economists of centuries prior, in terms of the notion of increase upon natural givenness, that surplus is being unequally distributed in that it's all going to a very small class of people, the bourgeois capitalist class in his day. And in our day, that inequity is at least as visible, I think, when we look at
for
the
sure.
relationship of the ownership of that excess value, which is being created in
The 1%, as it's
fantastic
called.
amounts. Exactly, right? And, that's the thing he really wants to tame. And in that sense, I think we can get on board with that notion. We may disagree with all the rest of what he's going to say afterwards, but
Dave knows this because he's spoken with Marx through Ouija board at least a dozen times.
just last Tuesday.
Wow, what is he saying on Tuesday?
Actually, one of the most interesting
He
places...
made muffins.
One of the most interesting things to learn, places to learn actually about Marx as a dude, is to read his journalism. He wrote for newspapers in New York and in London, and in fact comments on the Civil War at some length in the United States, which is, his and Engels' review of world politics at the time, absolutely fascinating writing.
But what do you think is scarce in the Star Trek future, Dave? Experience, like an evening at Cisco's Creole Kitchen.
Yeah, I would say, seeing
The
not
night
on
at Sandrine.
seeing the not holodeck version of the lights of the asteroid fields on was it Panthara 5 or
The
whatever it
Northern
is,
Lights.
right? Or actually going to see baseball on Cestus 3,
Yes.
for instance, right?
That seems like a very real commodity to Cisco.
I can definitely
He
see
watches
Jake
baseball in the
Sisko
holiday.
covering
Yeah.
their World Series, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Right? I think, when Tam Elbrin talks about the hello ritual of that beautiful, when he says their minds are glacial, they're so quiet and still and tranquil. I mean, that is better than much fine gold or sweet honey to him, right? Yeah, absolutely. I think experience is definitely a kind of a commodity there.
To the Gideons in the Mark of Gideon. The
Sure.
TOS episode, they, I forget her name, but she says a Gideon would kill for a moment alone because they're so overpopulated
Sure.
that the planet looks like a kind of a goo from space.
Oh, that's
'cause
right.
there's just
That's
so many
right.
people.
It's just pulsating with
Yeah.
people. I
Yeah.
forgot about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like a moment alone. Imagine that being a commodity.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, one thinks of Kowloon Walled City or other places on Earth where the density of population is so profound.
What do you think the effects on the human brain are of removing the economic problem? People may say that perhaps aren't as on board with Trek as you and I.
Sure.
That some of the characters, if not all of the characters, seem unrealistic. They're so
Okay.
positive, they're so helpful. Even the kids, Jake Sisko stays up to help Nog learn how to read. Wesley is
Sure.
just, perfectly positive all the time, super smart, studious,
Yeah. And that
listens
may
to his
be
mother.
that may be one of the constitutional challenges of their culture.
But as Sisko says in an episode,
Mm-hmm.
it's easy to be a saint in paradise.
I can see that as well.
So I don't see it as really unrealistic. If you're living in a paradise, it's actually harder to not be a saint.
And I think
quote,
what we also see is
everyone
the
else around you,
effects-
there's no
Yeah, sure.
scarcity. Like,
Well, and we see the effect of a change of culture, right? Absolutely. All of our basic assumptions are built on the reality of the economic problem.
yeah,
And I think that's something that's useful to accept, right? But I think we can, for instance, there are cultures on Earth who don't subsist under the economic problem as such. If you think about some of the remaining hunter-gatherer tribes on
subsistent
Earth,
society,
right?
so-
Who can catch enough food. Literally, I watched a beautiful interview with some tribes people who live close to the Maasai but aren't Maasai. And they're talking, he says, what makes you happy? When are you happy? They say, we're happy when we have meat and when I think we have honey. And that's happy. That's having it all, And they say, and otherwise we go and we make war with the baboons. And we take some of them, or we hunt something else. We hunt what we can, but their sense they don't in that sense have a condition called poverty, and they don't have a condition called wealth. And in that sense, the economic problem doesn't exist in that respect. The economic problem is a question of subsistence and survival in the most in a very sort of primordial and beautifully given sense. Whereas some of us who live in societies that have sort of sophisticated a relationship to nature that is more layered or more veiled or more, alienated or distanced or whatever, dominating, however you want to describe it, I think the economic problem plays for us differently. My happiness isn't produced because I can get meat at the grocery store anytime. So my happiness ends up like in what Plato talks about, as he calls an early form of the good city, called what he calls the city of pigs, which is the city that has satisfied its basic material needs and now becomes delighted in delicacy. Because that's no longer particularly satisfying. We now move on to the next most scarce thing, which, as you've already said, in that sense, is a scarcity of experience, but they're experienced as material consumption, resource, or honor.
I feel like Kivas Fajo is actually the ultimate new capitalist. If the new capital is just rarity
Sure.
And he's
Just to
kind
have
he's
literally
won
the
that
most unique
game.
toys.
He's kind of that.
Yeah.
He's the capitalist of that era.
Or maybe he was the capitalist.
Was the capitalist of that era.
Who's running that ship now? That's a good question. So,
An interesting TNG episode regarding economics
Mm-hmm.
is The Neutral Zone.
season 1, episode 26.
Indeed. Interesting way to end the season.
Yeah, well, it was right after one of the more controversial episodes in the series run, which is the secret invasion of the crazy bugs, and they blow up Rimmer's head.
Oh, sure.
Or Remick, sorry, not
Remick,
Rimmer.
yep.
For all you Red Dwarf fans out there, I just made a fun mistake and turned him into a hologram. Not impossible in Star Trek, but
Nope.
didn't happen in this case. His head blew up.
Yep.
But back to the point at hand.
The point that was in my hand.
About the neutral zone and these
The
folks
neutral
that
zone,
wake
well,
up.
yes, you get, what's his name? Offenhouse.
Yes. I want to talk to my bank on Earth.
Yeah. And that's when you get the big Picard speech about how humanity has evolved past the need for things, and we work to better ourselves and all of humanity and all that.
Which Rom so beautifully sends up in the beginning of the episode about the Willie Mays baseball card. It's like, you guys don't need things, and you say you're all past money.
Oh, yeah.
Except when you want to buy something, then it's Rom. Where do you keep your last
Yeah,
money?
where do you keep your, you don't really keep it under your bed, do you?
That's right.
That's so not Ferengi. So in Star Trek, the removal of human labor goes hand in hand with the even distribution of wealth.
And so in labor, in this sense, you're meaning industrial production in terms of agriculture, in terms
Sure.
of providing the necessities and removing the scarcity from life. Because there's lots of labor happening.
Which, to the point that, did I make that point to you off air or on air? I'm going to make it right now. That this book, Trekonomics, makes the claim that the Star Trek Federation future is pretty much the business as usual sci-fi
You
future.
pointed to that earlier, yeah.
Okay, I
that is
did.
sort of like the most statistically likely, because it actually
Yes.
allows our impulses to
Yeah.
kind of find a fruition through necessity.
And an
that doesn't
example of
disrupt
that,
them too much.
the amount of people involved in agriculture has gone down
Oh, profoundly.
so drastically over the last 100 years, for
Yeah.
example. So human labor is already worth a lot less than it used to be. So that's trending in the right direction. But
While it has profoundly difficult consequences for people in this transitional time.
it absolutely
I mean, I think
does.
that's
It's not
one of the
valued enough
challengings
for the
of
people actually doing
economic
that
realities,
work.
right?
Yeah.
As we see people crying for places to live
Mm-hmm.
down south of our particular border, or in many other places in the world right now.
We are in a transitional time, but we're going to get there. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. That's what Locutors of Trek is here for.
Preach it, brother.
We should keep that going in every episode. We're gonna
It's
We're
true.
gonna-
It gets better.
we're going all the way to the Federation.
Yeah. Sometimes you hit a rock bottom occasionally. Even the Federation does, right?
Sure.
They get smacked around by the Borg. They get all sorts of crazy stuff. The Organians have to step in every once in a while.
Xindi shoot up the planet from space sometime.
Exactly. They even have crises of confidence in their own form of government.
Sure.
With, during
Leighton.
Deep Space Nine and Leighton and all sorts of things, right?
It's true.
Anyway.
With the fellow on Ryza there,
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Captain Doofus.
Captain Doofus.
I forget what
was
his
he
name
a
is.
captain? Of what?
I don't think so.
Of what, Dave?
Doofusry.
oh, you know what? I think you're right. He was a captain.
That was his specific specialty.
right.
And he
Captain-
was allowed to practice that because of the economic formulation in which he found himself. He could get tickets to Ryza simply by booking them over the local, digital network.
Ryza is a great example of the post-scarcity society and the lack of economic barter or monetary exchange. When you go to Ryza, everyone's offering up Jamaharon, and no one's asking for anything in return.
Do you seek Jamaharon?
I don't even know what it means.
That's true. So either it's all paid for already, or the sense is that Ryzen culture, whatever that would be, values this Jamaharon to the degree that it actually becomes one of their cultural offerings with people. And that's an interesting cultural question of resource.
That's the planetary export. They don't export anything, but if you come there, everything is free.
economy of experience. And the other side of that is that one of the other things you're experiencing, I think, is the planet itself, right? Because what we know from one of DS9's most awkward episodes with Captain Doofus is that when you mess with Ryza's weather control systems, its weather probably is effectively nastier than Ferenginar's on a regular day, right? Constant sleeting rain and lightning and thunderstorms, not just the kind of warm, wet rain that Ferenginar has, which makes lovely mud that's good for
It's a rainforest that rains constantly.
Right?
Yeah.
And, Ryza wouldn't be the same. Ryza would be a misery world.
The directorial debut of one René Aubergenois.
Was that episode?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
I don't think he looked back on it fondly.
Probably not.
It's like somebody hated
Although that
me,
does ask an interesting question about Odo. Can he have functionally eyes in the back of his head, or does he just perceive in 360 degrees all the time?
I've always wondered that, actually, because his eyes are fake.
Yeah.
I assume he just perceives in all directions, but
I assume so.
I almost see his perception being that of like daredevils in the Marvel universe.
Sure, or more like Geordie's, where it's like a spectral thing or something. Yeah,
Geordie's in like all directions.
The fundamental existential question, I think, in that kind of an economy is
now,
how do I want to express my being? What kind of humanity do I want to, or Bajoranity, or whatever you want to call it? Like, what kind of life do I want to pursue?
Yeah. That's a question in a post-scarcity society. How do you get people to do the dirty work that still may need to be done?
Sure.
On some level, you're still going to need people to oversee the robots or do things the robots can't do, or get the thing the replicators can't make.
Yeah. And, some of that may be an economy of opportunity in that sense. In the sense of, think about it, when we see Picard crash flaming to Earth in that wonderful episode, Family. Brothers is the episode afterwards.
All right, look, we don't need to talk about family and brothers. We've been over this several times.
That's a
on
mea
Locutors
culpa
of
on
Trek.
my part. I think I mentioned it more times than you. So we...
We're talking about how do you get people to do the dirty work,
Yeah. So an economy of opportunity is really what I'm thinking about here. So the sense that when we see Picard crash sort of flaming to Earth in Family, one of the people he meets is Lewis.
Yeah.
His friend who's working on essentially a kind of subsea habitation,
which they want
raising
Picard
up a continent
to
process.
Kind of lead the charge on.
Right? Because they think scientifically he would be interested in it.
Which he is.
Which is true. It would be a great move for him.
It's very fascinating to me.
It would be fascinating as a career move for him from Starfleet to that.
And to me, I found it very interesting that Earth hadn't done that already by that point. That undersea habitation is just new in Picard's time. I found that pretty interesting.
Well, and it may be.
And you know what? It's been said that we've explored our solar system more than our own oceans.
And it's quite likely true in many respects. And that may, again, the lure of out there may well have captivated their attention for several centuries, such that the lure of what lies beneath only gets this now, right?
I mean, how interesting is an ocean with only 2 humpback whales in it?
Well, that's true. Oh, I wonder how many there are by the time we get to Picard's time.
How vigorous do you think George and Gracie were?
Fair enough. Did they make any other trips back to collect others? We just need to get a good population, folks. Just get that old Klingon ship. No, it's got the right tanks, right? So, it's got the whale tanks.
There'll be whales here.
Here there be whales. So, there's an interesting resource. They literally go back in time to acquire that.
But there's another commodity too. Say in Star Trek time, if there's still like very, very low whale populations, seeing one.
Sure, absolutely. Again, back to the economy of experience. Now,
back to our beloved Nova Scotia. Great whale watching here in Nova Scotia.
Indeed. Oh, yeah.
You know what we're going to get to, Dave? Nova Scotia's mentioned in Trekonomics.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I love
we in Nova Scotia get very, very excited when Nova Scotia is mentioned in anything because
I remember when they did it on the West Wing of the city. He said Nova Scotia. And I was like, what?
What? Did Martin Sheen just say Nova Scotia?
Yeah, probably Lunenburg. Anyway, It's got
Maybe.
the pretty town.
It's a
Peggy's
nice town. I
Cove.
like Lunenburg, yeah.
Well, it's a great town. Beautiful. Yeah.
Been to the Fisheries Museum many a time.
Oh, man. It's a great spot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
A
shout out to Lunenburg.
Tourism Lunenburg.
Apply for all your advertising dollars here.
Maybe we can get a sponsorship with Nova Scotia.
Well, that'd be great. Make a trek.
Oh, well, there you have it.
Now we got our slogan. See? I'm going to have to patent that quick so I can get more Latinum for it.
We're going to take a break while Dave patents that slogan.
All right, let me run off to the patent office. I don't think it works that way. Clearly, I've never patented anything before. But
I think that comes from also, like, people like to challenge themselves and do difficult things.
sure. But I think there's also a question of the people that you know and how they know of you and how that hooks you up to things, right? Because you're not doing this for a peculiar monetary gain. That's not one of the impulses involved.
No.
Which, when Captain Janeway comes and seeks out Tom Paris, partly it's because I think she knows Admiral Paris.
Yeah. Oh,
And
sure.
that set of associations means she says, I've known of Tom at least, and I'd like to give him a second chance, and here's a chance that lets him pit himself against the thing and demonstrate a good faith in Starfleet that could let him get back on track.
Thomas Locarno Paris.
Right? He doesn't necessarily get that, even though he's in a relatively pleasant prison.
Oh, sure.
He's derailed his whole life.
New Zealand sounds very nice. Never been.
I think it's beautiful. I'd like to go to Wellington.
Me too.
With sway wolves, not werewolves.
That's
Werewolves,
true.
not sway wolves. Sorry, I reversed that. Clearly, I'm not a werewolf either.
Trek wolves, not feck wolves. But for the average Hooman, or Federation citizen, really, because in general, if you're not talking about the colonies, like your main Federation worlds, seem to have a similar level of wealth and quality of life.
Sure.
Like Andor, Vulcan, Earth, Tellar.
I mean, people seem
Probably
pretty
not a
well
big
taken
difference in
care
your
of
quality
everywhere.
of life.
It's just going to be the flavor of life that
I
differs,
mean,
I think, more than anything.
I take that back. Your quality of life is going to be way worse on Andor, because as we've discussed on the show before, she's pretty cold.
It's cold enough for you.
She's cold
And,
enough for you.
if you're not a Vulcan, Vulcan's going to be tough to manage. But that's
it's kind of
ecology and
dry,
biology,
especially
right?
for ocean folk like you and I.
Right. I think we
Yeah,
miss
I
the
bet you
smell
the
of the
air's
sea
pretty
pretty
dry.
wickedly. There is, I think, an ocean on Vulcan, but it's not a big one either.
It's like smaller than Lake Huron.
I can only imagine Vulcan fish being terribly dangerous as well. But, that doesn't mean that for Vulcans...
more water like cascades off my roof in a year.
Since last weekend.
Sure. There was a couple of hard rains.
Oh, man. I had a drip in my house, that's for sure. But, for Vulcans on Vulcan, let's say, or Andorians on Andor, or humans on Earth, or, wherever you can comfortably exist geographically, geologically, biologically.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's economically going to be very little difference than the nuance of your situation. Everything you need is going to be available to you.
So ownership becomes a burden.
Sure. You'd want to
Because-
travel light, I'd think.
Say you own whatever the, I guess it would be a holodeck, but I was going to say the future equivalent of a Super Nintendo Entertainment System.
Sure.
Something someone like myself plays.
Sure.
If you own that, you then have to know somebody who can fix that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe know somebody who can supply that, whatever it is.
You're also going to want to have somewhere to house that where it doesn't get rained on, And you're going to want to connect it to an electrical grid.
Super Nintendo can take a few brains.
I don't want to leave it out for long, though. That would just be electronic abuse, I think.
Yeah, it would be, actually. Yeah. I wouldn't approve of that either.
At this point, it might be beating up an antique as well. I'm not sure.
Super Nintendo would have quite a bit of value in the Star Trek future.
Oh, for sure.
Though, everyone will still be working. That
In that sense, it's labor as a productive value for human life rather than for economic activity, though, right? People take the job they take because they're interested or because they feel it necessary or they have some commitment they're going to make to do it.
Well, I think what we've seen is that the things that people own in Star Trek, I think we've probably seen it the most with Picard and Sisko, is the things that they own are just sentimental things.
They absolutely prefer. They're
historical
self-referential.
things.
Yeah. That baseball.
The baseball.
Baseball ends up having a deeply symbolic value.
Sisko collects ancient African art.
Yeah. Picard and his
Picard-
Resican flute. Well, that whole room full
Picard
of beautiful
collects
stuff
antiques.
in Picard.
He collects like
Sure. Well, and archaeological objects and-
artifacts
yeah.
and things like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Well, even Riker and his trombones, or Worf and his Klingon weaponry.
Riker and his jazz.
Sure.
That's the antique in his life.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure he goes for pristine recordings. He may well be a stereo nerd.
Oh, by the way, this is episode 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12.
That's right. We are counting in 12 Riker time now. So, I think in other places you might find, or in other cultural formations, you might find different relationships to things. Ferengi clearly have different relationship to things. Klingons, specifically in terms of their lands, their ships.
See, that's where I see Klingon and human life in that time not too dissimilar. Where, imagine if you were trying to take Sisko's restaurant away from Joseph Sisko. I would argue he may fight harder than Kern fought to stop.
Well, he goes right to having a heart attack.
He would fake 3 heart attacks, but if that didn't work.
He's pushed to the point where his body is so stressed about the change in conditions on Earth under latent strictures he literally has a heart attack, which
does have a heart
I can only imagine is fairly rare on Earth at that time.
That and his own son kind of questioning.
Absolutely,
he was,
right? That's a level of subversion.
He didn't like
of
the
his
militarization
expectation.
of Earth.
Exactly.
Earth had been a paradise probably for his entire life.
Oh, since the 22nd century sometime, I would think, yeah. Given the past 18 months we've just lived through, I think we can relate to the degree in which a sudden, rapid, global change in our conditions of life, the patterns with which we can do it, and the way that has ramifications upon us economically. You think about the people that could come into his restaurant, and his economy is an economy of friendship and service and excellence.
Yes, no one ever.
Right? Nobody comes there because he
Joseph
serves
Sisko.
bad
No
food.
one pays Joseph
and it's
Sisko
cheap.
either.
Right? They come there because he serves the best Creole food they can find.
Yes, exactly. Which comes back to what has value.
Right? His excellence has value.
Exactly.
His
and
passion.
his hospitality.
That's part of
If
the
it's good
excellence,
enough
though, right?
for him, it's good enough for if it's good enough for you, it's good enough for him.
Exactly. I remember being down, again, this is about Nova Scotia. I remember being down.
That's fine. We're a Nova Scotian podcast.
The French Shore past, Matagan area.
Oh, sure.
Saulniéville sort of area. There was this restaurant out there which was in an old house. And
Very
it's
nice.
beautiful out by the seashore. It was the kind of one that
Did
had
they
built by
sell
somebody.
seashells down by that seashore?
They may well have, but it was the kind of house that was built by somebody who built ships. So it creaked when the wind blew, right? It had a beautiful cast iron stove with a bread warmer in the middle of it. We
Cast
sat down there
iron's
to
where it's at, let me tell you.
oh man, sat down there to a scallops and shrimp and shellfish kind of dinner. Beautiful Acadian food. And in the middle of it, the fellow who owned the place comes out and he sits down at a piano and he starts playing. And some members of my family who are singers and many others around joined in. Partly because it was something I think that recalled to them.
What was the tune?
I don't recall now, but it was beautiful. It was a rousing sort of Acadian, almost a real kind of a tune.
Oh, yeah.
But, it recalled those moments in our own culture where we gathered to sing and make music together before we consumed it as an electronic commodity more primarily.
The Nova Scotia kitchen party.
Exactly,
If
right?
you've
And
never
all of a
been,
sudden,
people gather in a kitchen in Nova Scotia.
that's where the party
We sing
is.
and we play.
Even when you don't mean to, when you have a party, the good place to be is in the kitchen.
That's where it's at.
That's where it's happening.
You know why, though? Like, when it comes down to it, there's a lot of romantic notions on why that is.
You're closer to the fridge, man.
No, that's not it. See, that's one of the romantic notions. The real reason. You're hearing it here first, maybe. I might be breaking Nova Scotian.
Maybe you're breaking secrecy taboos.
I
But
might
lay it
be.
on us.
The real reason Nova Scotian kitchen parties happen in the kitchen is because that's where most of the chairs are. There's literally no other reason. I'm right. If anyone argues with you,
I can't dispute. It's just truth.
there's
It's
at
not
least
just truth,
there's
it's truth.
4 to 6 around the kitchen table, and that's more than every other room.
Yeah.
That's and a nice wooden kitchen chair is perfect for playing a guitar.
Yep.
Because
Playing a game of crib?
you can't have something with arms or something
No,
like that.
that's
you know?
pointless.
So that's why.
Good for good
You've heard it
argument.
here first. Locutors of Czech.
Right here.
Broken the myth of Nova Scotia.
All
kitchen
your
parties.
Trek and Nova Scotia analysis.
The party is where the chairs are.
Indeed. So, that's the economy in Nova Scotia parties. It's a chair economy.
There's another economy. What has value? A chair at a kitchen party.
Kitchen chair. Right
You
there.
don't want
got
to be
it.
one of those suckers leaning against the fridge. That's for sure.
Counter leaners acceptable.
Oh, sure, because you
Sure.
can rest an elbow.
Oh, yeah.
Set your drink down.
Put your cold one there.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Now,
What were we talking about?
I have no idea anymore.
We got distracted by...
We did.
Well, you know what we could talk about, Dave?
What's that?
Supply management in Star Trek.
Oh,
Because
interesting.
with all of this utopia that we see on Earth, there has to be some strict management of that.
Absolutely. I can only
Because,
imagine.
for example, you have anything that's a common resource. You have, like, the tragedy of the commons, for example.
Okay, say more.
Well, the tragedy of the commons, I forget whose work that was, but is the assumed inevitability that if you have a common resource, say there was what was called the commons back in, I believe, medieval times.
Okay. Where you'd have your sheep and things.
Yeah, it was just public grazing land.
Yep.
Anyone could use it. You could plant things on it if you wanted, but inevitably that land would become depleted. And that's the tragedy of the commons. That if you open something up to public use, which seems like a great and wonderful thing to do.
So this sense of the depletion of the returns of this common resource by overuse or overexploitation. The
Now,
collapse of fish stocks.
That's the Nova Scotia.
that sort of thing, right?
That's where Nova Scotia came up in this book. That
For sure. Okay, right on.
The Nova Scotia cod stocks were completely depleted. I've never caught a codfish. I'm a fisherman.
I've caught one in my entire life.
Not in Nova Scotia.
No, off the shore, North Shore PEI.
Yes, exactly.
Yep, not Newfoundland, not Nova Scotia.
There ain't no codfish around Nova Scotia.
And it was only a sport fishery. You were allowed to catch 2 or 3. That's
Yeah.
it.
In Newfoundland, we still have a decent cod fishery, but
It's made a recovery
collapsed.
somewhat.
It recovered.
But, ooh. And actually a startling recovery, but its collapse was
It's-
more startling still, I think.
That's one of the hopeful things. Same with the Star Trek future.
That had it kind of found a way.
positivity isn't as hard as it may seem. The positive outcomes.
Well, this to me is a really interesting
It
question,
almost
but say
takes
more.
resistance to stop it from happening.
Resistance is futile.
And I wonder sometimes if our inability to see the positive from these circumstances is partly about our
It's from-
consciousness
it's
of the
from
straight
short-term
circumstances.
thinking as well.
Sure, but also from sometimes the heightened sense of agency involved in recognizing our own responsibility for the situation we may actually be in. But that may well sort of metaphorically extend itself further than its actual real range because of that the sense of the gravitas of that responsibility, right?
Well, that makes me think of what is talked about in Trekonomics with one of the difficulties other than negative externalities.
Okay.
Which
Sure.
which we could get into that.
In that sense, calculating the price of fuel into the orange you get that's shipped from Florida. That'd be a negative externality in that sense if we were to actually price that in.
Yeah.
But I mean, the things that are considered ultimately external to the functioning of a particular economic system.
Yeah. And a lot of times certain projections and equations, they just don't take into certain negative externalities. But
Sure.
What seems to be more true is they don't take into positive externalities, which is where the Star Trek future really seems more plausible.
When
An
we respect-
example, with the rebounding of cod stocks in Newfoundland, haddock
Sure.
stocks in Nova Scotia. But for example, there was, I don't know if you're familiar with the guano.
Like bat poop?
Yeah, well, more so bird poop, like
Okay.
like seagulls and things.
Okay.
Like there were have you ever heard of Guano Islands?
Oh yeah, where they were getting, because there's a chemical
You
compound
can
in
mine
there
it.
that's particularly useful. I forget, in some kind of industrial production.
Well, no,
right?
it's in agriculture.
Oh, okay. This is
Gua-
fertilizer.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was the fertilizer.
I know that one of the reasons for American expansion into the Pacific at one point was because of these islands.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
these are islands that have just been pooped on by seagulls for
Yeah.
millennia.
They call it the Crapper Islands, but
They call it.
fair enough.
But yeah, so these guano islands were basically entirely depleted. It was such.
So they literally
demand
cleaned the poop right off.
off all of these Pacific and South
Wow.
American islands.
How long did it take for the poop to build back?
It basically that's a resource that isn't really renewable. Like you
Because of the
you
drop in
can-
bird stocks.
Well, it's just no. The length of time it actually takes to do that.
Oh, I
Like,
see.
It took millennia to build up. These
Oh, I see. Right.
Like,
We're
like,
just
a
dealing
couple
at a
hundred
different
years
scale
of
of
bird
time.
poop isn't really mineable.
Sure,
you know?
sure. I see what you're saying.
So what happened was they needed to come up with a solution to how are we going to replace all this fertilizer demand.
Okay.
And that's when the invention of pulling ammonium nitrate from just atmospheric oxygen and nitrogen was invented, which won a Nobel
Fascinating.
Prize.
Fascinating.
Because in
I mean, that is one of the
been
more
talked of
widely
one of
used
the-
fertilizers in
it's,
the world.
it's been called the best invention of the 20th century.
That's fascinating. Wow.
Um,
I mean, and it has its other dire uses. Ammonium nitrate is the same explosive that was used
sure.
in the First World War to create all of the great mines and things and explosions.
I believe it's
that we see.
ammonium nitrate, but specifically it's the
Yeah, yeah.
ammonium that's quite
Sure,
useful
absolutely.
in agriculture.
I should imagine. Nitrate would, I assume, fix it in some sense. You
Hmm.
could put it in the ground.
But
But again, these are the nuts and bolts of how you grow things, right, on planets that would definitely affect a galactic economy. And the other thing to my mind would be warp speed. That level of travel is still just unbelievably faster than a radio transmission we were talking about with the Fermi paradox earlier. You know, warp 3 is something like, 314 or 318 at least times the speed of light by any reasonable calculation. So you're going to make, or let me just make sure. But, I mean, it's tremendously quick.
well, that brings me to some of the more counter arguments to Star Trek, actually, such as like Thomas Malthus.
Oh, yeah.
A Malthusian perspective is certainly not very Star Trek.
No, the struggle in it. Sorry, 38 times the speed of light. I apologize. The struggle for life in Malthus is a particularly brutal affair.
And a kind of Malthus' successors, such as like Paul Ehrlich. They don't take into account these technological advances or even social advances, like the guano island
Sure.
ammonium nitrate thing I mentioned.
Yeah, and it's
And
certainly in
that's the thing
Malthus's
about
case,
predictions. It's like, how can you predict these?
yeah, Malthus was looking from the 19th century because he's, I think, slightly prior to Darwin, if I recall correctly.
Well, that's the
Or
thing.
roughly contemporary.
Malthus did inspire Darwin, but
I mean, Darwin's ideas are quite
he also
different.
inspired social Darwinism and eugenics.
Absolutely, right? Because, I mean, like, on Malthus is really like a
Malthus
weirdly
leads to
formative figure in that sense, right? Because he's deeply problematic. He sees both the abundance that nature produces, but he also looks at things like, the way fish produce offspring. Millions and millions of eggs. The
Yes, he thinks
90%
human
of them
growth
don't
is
survive.
exponential, but material or whatever we can produce growth is linear.
And so he sees our populations and competitions as roughly like other animal stocks in that sense, in air quotes.
But that's where
that we rise and fall and rise and fall, and the competition has this grisly quality to it.
But would Malthus have ever believed how few people work in agriculture now, for example?
I think it would have been difficult from his perspective he certainly could have believed the increasing urbanization of life and the technical increase that would decrease the number of laborers in agriculture, but I don't think he would have predicted the radical decrease we see now. And that's from a process of automation and high-speed industrial
That's where
production.
automation comes in. That's where,
The roboticization and a chemicalization of big agriculture.
And Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb, predicted that there was only a 10% chance of human civilization avoiding civilizational collapse. Now that seems very pessimistic to me. Like I have a Star Trek podcast, so
There is a certain
I'm on the
optimism built
positives.
in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
But
now, I mean, mind you, Star Trek does contain civilizational collapse. And, you know, in
Almost.
but I mean, you know, the forms of 20th century life that survive into, you know, Zephyr Cochrane's time, let alone
The important
their
things,
aesthetic forms, right?
The important
business
things
suit
persist.
survives.
Like their science seems to persist.
Sure.
Zephyr Cochrane can still make a warp engine.
Yeah.
But like the monetary system collapsed. They moved back to barter.
Yeah.
At the time of Zephyr Cochrane, it was all about
And
barter.
like a lot of their production systems and the notion of industrial production, you're exactly right. I think they absolutely hold on. But the framework of the material conditions in which those are understood changes significantly enough that I think people begin to see them as a utility. If for lack of a better word, I think people begin to see those things as a utility, just like we see electricity and running water and other forms of things like that. I think people see industrial production as a utility in that future rather than as a means to profit. And that does fundamentally change your behavior toward it, to me.
And from that post-World War III place they found themselves in, they sort of, and a return to barter. They had a blank slate to, you know, form a new economic system.
And I think also cautionary tales from their own history. The Bell Riots, the eugenics
Bell
wars
Riots.
which precede the Bell Riots. You know, Con came before the Bell Riots, right?
Was Con before the Bell?
The
Yes,
1990s and
between-
early
yeah,
2000s.
Yes, you're right.
Remember, we're projecting from 1968 forward there to get
True.
to that those years. And those are pretty dire years for humanity. There's a huge set of wars that comes about from unbridled genetic tinkering to produce super soldiers.
Yeah.
Because Khan's a certain pitch creature, but he's the pitch of a culture that relies on dominance, economic, military, political, and otherwise, in order to assure its ends. And Khan's the ultimate product of that and takes over, I think, half the world at one point before he's ultimately driven off of it into an escape on this sleeper ship, the USS Botany Bay, or SS Botany Bay, sorry. A DY-100 class sleeper generation style ship.
Money.
Oh, money.
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 Money in the 22nd, 3rd, and 4th century.
Whew, quick
What
time.
do we think? Well, as we know, money is designed to free us from the inefficiency of barter,
Okay. Yep.
which, you know, we returned to barter around Zephyr Cochrane's time.
And so new possibilities can be envisioned.
Yes, exactly. But of course, barter is, of course, inefficient. You have to have what that person wants to get the
Sure.
thing you want.
Or some other market of exchange which requires either physical or
That's why we came
informational
up with
coordination. Yeah. I can see how it could disappear temporarily if you have an information economy and a digital economy already. But that requires those things to be in place.
In the first version we see of that is Federation credits.
Sure.
And that's the go-to kind of thing in science fiction. Babylon 5, a lot of these other shows use credits. Credits is the thing in the future.
And that seems to be a way to usefully standardize a world economy. You know, a global
Total Recall
currency.
has credits. Like,
Yeah,
you know.
absolutely.
But it's the same thing. It's like we agree on dollars, we agree on credits,
Yeah.
whatever.
Some sort of currency. And I don't think those credits have, I don't know whether in the 21st century of Star Trek or the 22nd century, they retreat from the notion of a fiat currency or not. You know, that notion of currency, which is simply an agreed upon value, not tied to any standard such as, say, the value of gold,
or whatever. Yeah.
which is the current model of currency with which we work and has enabled things like modern monetary theory, which is a totally different understanding of currency and the function of
It
markets
just seems
than
to be tied
Keynesian
to
theory.
the wealth of the Federation. It doesn't need to be based against anything because the Federation has anything it needs.
I think that's the case. I think what they're able
Do you
to
want
sort
gold?
of
Okay, we have gold.
yeah,
Or
what they're
like-
able to understand is that they have the sort of brunt of the whole Federation economy available to them at any given point. You know, because to me, in a certain sense, the Federation is really about governing the space between the stars. Because it's not about telling you what to do on your own planet. It's not about telling you how your traditions should work, unless those traditions include slavery, let's be honest.
Sure.
But that's pretty much the only one.
They don't like that one.
They don't like that one at all. And that, again, is an economic question as well as a question of the dignity of sentient beings, both tied up in the Federation Charter. But the the sense of governing the space between and that connects all of these things is almost like being a sort of Zeus, you know, the ancient Greek god of kingship, but also of hospitality, who governed the spaces between cities where other gods might not hold sway in quite the same fashion, right? It seems to me that the Federation would be able to harmonize, like it does at the level of currency, all of that material continuum as well.
The great material continuum?
I don't know if they're that advanced yet, but certainly the continuum of a material resource they have in all of those massive numbers of star systems.
Oh, quaint. Very, very quaint.
I mean, you know, they're getting there.
Yeah.
They're making their way in the world today. Takes everything they've got.
So what it's likely the new currency is in once post Federation credits, because after Kirk's era, they're kind of phased out.
They become essentially a mechanical notion more than anything.
And like Quark laughs at them, for example. He does end up accepting them. I think a few
he'll
times
accept
on
them,
the
but he's
outside.
like, that's only because you have the whole Federation promising to pay your bar tab, essentially.
Basically.
Which is weird.
It's kind of weird.
From Quark's perspective, it's bizarre, I'm sure.
It's like,
It's like, you don't have your
your
own money.
boss
You
will
just
pay your bar tab?
yeah. Well, the Federation will do that for me. Just build the Federation. It's fine. I'm with the band, you know.
But essentially, reputation is the new currency, at least in Starfleet. What everyone strives for, they don't strive for more money. They want the most, lauded paper or...
Glory to you and your house.
But the kinds of glory, you know, that Daystrom has,
Sure.
or other figures of that.
But, you see
variety.
it a lot with Geordi in TNG. He's always concerned about what his peers think or where he ranks amongst his peers.
Sure.
And that's what they want, at least in Starfleet. But in Starfleet, we see the kind of the best of humanity.
We kind of see the eager beavers, right?
Yeah, we do.
But I think even among other humans, you see even those who don't have an interest in pursuing a Starfleet career, that wonderful set of scenes in DS9 between Jake and Ben Sisko on that Bajoran lightship, where he's telling his dad about his desire to be a writer and offering him some of these first pieces he's really seriously written, is a really beautiful moment, because he's charting a course literally on this thing that's trying to chart a course in the void, outside of his dad's realm of expectations for him. Even though, his dad's a Starfleet man, his father's a chef, and he's going to be a writer. So in some sense, I don't think that Ben Sisko was as daunting a figure as maybe he was in Jake's mind, but he's Jake's dad, and he wants his dad to be proud of him.
I would like to know in whose mind
approve.
Ben Sisko was not a daunting figure.
I guess what I mean is in terms of whether he's going to approve of Jake's course in life.
I think
he's ready
Worf.
to do that.
We remember he intimidated Worf.
No, that's fair. That's fair. I guess what I mean is in the sense that Jake was worried his dad wouldn't approve that he wanted to be a writer.
True.
And
well, yeah,
Ben Sisko wants Jake to be
which we
his
see
own
even
man.
with Wesley in a way. He went with the Starfleet route, but it's always
It's another way of playing
Starfleet families will continue in that vein.
Absolutely. And, I thought that was one of the most beautiful ways of seeing that difference happen. That Sisko is just proud of him. He's like, you know what? You're going to be your own guy. And that's the adventure. But that really is the sort of Federation sense of what's valuable, what's currency. You're going to be who you are. You're going to be authentic.
Now, with reputation as a new currency, do you think there's any correlation between that and likes on Facebook? Or
that's interesting.
Your Twitter followers. Is reputation the new currency? In some way.
I can see what you mean by that. Yeah. I mean, in a certain sense, what I feel is really the reality of the sort of likes on social media is the growing awareness of ourselves as a statistical reality as much as an individual reality. And that to me is actually, as much as right now the growing pains are kind of gorky and can be very vindictive as well as elevating. That's like the growing pains of something that is the birthing of a consciousness of ourselves as a human organism as points in a wave of the development of a species. And to me, that's kind of exciting.
Yeah.
We've concentrated for a long time in our sort of culturally dominant, sort of the things that communicate the most airwaves and that sort of thing. But individuality and the pursuit of what makes me happy, rather than what actually is for the good of the many rather than the few or the one. And I think that element is something we're beginning to realize even without having met the Vulcans yet. Maybe by having imagined the Vulcans, it makes it easier. And that's one of the things that I love about Star Trek in that respect, is that, we project these total fictions forward, just like Benny Russell does from his room in Manhattan or wherever that was. And I don't know what city it was. It feels like New York, but anyway. We project those things outward.
Yeah, because Willie Mace.
Exactly. And they come back to us in some form, maybe, that we can realize. And to me, that's hopeful as well. That's the new possibility born in every instant that Arendt talks about as the human as a beginning in Augustinian terms,
Well, and that's the thing that a lot of these more negative predictions of the future, more dystopian views don't take into account, is the power of the human brain. If anything can potentially give out in the world more than it takes in, it's the human brain.
Oh, what a lovely point.
For example, Einstein, his brain probably contributed more to this planet than the energy he took in. we can afford him a few potatoes and broccoli and whatever,
I think we can manage that. Yeah, I see your point.
And what the Star Trek future makes possible is with the reduction of human labor, is it frees up more brains.
Yeah.
So that's the best result we can get with little put in.
But, in a certain sense, part of the value of living in that future is, and let's be honest, you get to go on spaceships.
Yeah.
And to me, literally, if somebody told me today that in a sort of non-billionaires, because they're taking the excess value from everybody else and making their, phallic projections from the planet sort of way, but that you could get on a spaceship and do useful, good work out there, I would be on that spaceship before you finished your sentence.
Oh, sure.
Because I have a literally inordinate love of spaceships. I want to be out there. And that, for me, would literally almost be payment enough to know that
I want to go on a 5-year
wake up on
mission
a
and come back to my farm.
Right? And see, that's the idea of this post-scarcity future, that we can do this, right? You can sit there and you can talk about your grapes and say, I'm going to come back to that, and I'm going to grow, and I'm going to see the vintage I laid down when I left.
I'm going to take some of it with me.
Right?
Spread my vintage throughout the galaxy.
You might even bring a Barrel Latinum or two home. You
Well,
never
let me
even
tell you,
know.
Dave, I've been to the
Put on your
Ferengi School of
mantelpiece.
Business for a couple of semesters.
That's true. See, these things are the hopeful, beautiful future. Not without its danger and its conflict, but the really beautiful future of living authentic lives that we can just kind of pursue, that I think Star Trek actually holds out in front of us, if we work for it.
But as far as negative externalities go, Dave, here's something I'm going to pose to you. You know the TNG episode Force of Nature,
Sure.
where we find out that warp travel is...
Stressing the fabric of space-time.
Indeed.
It's going to produce subspace tears, and already is in the particular sector of space the Enterprise finds itself in during the episode.
So this is a similar situation to the prisoner's dilemma. I'm not sure if you're familiar
Sure.
with that. Yeah. Where, you can rat out your buddy, you can stand pat, or you can,
Yeah,
different outcomes with each one.
sure.
So I'm going to kind of posit to you the Force of Nature episode version of that.
Okay, lay it on me.
So the Federation immediately says they'll limit warp travel at high speeds to try to curtail that.
Only to emergencies.
And the Klingons agree as well.
Right.
And they say, and Picard says, we only hope that the Romulans and others will do the same.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the spirit of the prisoner's dilemma, what should the Romulans, or Not so much what should the Romulans, I guess. What do you think the Romulans will do, and what should the Federation do? Because if the Federation curtails warp travel at high speeds and the Romulans don't, the environment for quote unquote is screwed anyway.
Right.
So they've just limited themselves as opposed to their enemy, the Romulans, with nothing to show for it at the end.
Sure.
You know, that
Sure.
sort of thing.
Well-
But if you choose to do it, you're also the person that's embracing the new reality, and you're ahead of them in that way. Like, there's a lot of different ways.
I
to
think
go
so.
about it.
Yeah. To me, I'm gonna follow on the sort of what I'm taking as the kind of Manu Sadhya angle here, which is that if we do a quick calculation of the number of starships that would be operating at any given time, and the number of them that we meet in TNG DS9, any series, that are commercial vessels that would routinely exceed Warp 5, it's very low. So, in the main, the economic knockoffs of this are
It's
going
more
to
of
be
a military
right.
issue.
It's going to be relatively small. So, to me, the Federation's best response is to say we will undertake this along with our allies, the Klingons. That'll also involve a redeployment of certain elements of our sector fleets going along the Romulan neutral zone, both on the Klingon and Federation side, to sit a few more of our ships out there more often. We're going to send their courses out closer to the neutral zone more frequently, so that if there is an incident with the Romulans, we'll have a higher density of ships to respond more quickly from a shorter distance at high warp. That would be my response.
What do you think the Romulans are going to do?
Not
Do you
tell
think they
you
would-
anything.
True.
First.
Do you think they curtail their high warp travel or no?
I think they would make a similar calculation, and given their history, I think the economic advantage for everybody is ultimately determined by the Federation's behavior. And as
Yeah.
long as they reinforce that border, there's no functional reason for the Romulans, unless they're planning a particular immediate offensive, to do any differently. Because they'll also end up realizing fuel
environment
savings.
being destroyed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they'll also end up realizing fuel savings and that sort of thing. I can see them,
But they'll
doing
say
a
they're not
bunch of-
doing it, but they're doing it.
and I can see them doing a bunch of espionage to get a hold of that research,
Yeah.
in order to assure themselves that this isn't a Federation ploy. There, they might spend any number of resources in the short term to acquire that, and use any amount of high warp they wanted. But yeah, I can see them maybe doing that in the long term.
And, you know, there's been people who've rejected these more negative projections of the future.
Sure.
And like Eleanor Ostrom, who wrote Governing the Commons. And
Mm-hmm.
and as we were talking about, she rejects these projections as just too simplistic. You can't take into the account the human brain. You can't take into account pulling ammonium from the...
Sure.
There's just no way to account for these things, or else you'd invent them. you
It's
know?
true. And what we tend to invent is what we can imagine in the near term.
Sure. Which is
Sometimes
where
we imagine
science
way
fiction
out.
plays
right?
plays a huge part.
But you know, you
Imagining
think about
the things before they're real.
the
How many
recent
times has Star
advances.
Trek done that?
Sure, you think about the recent advances in fusion power that have been talked about the last just week or two. That some of the laser-initiated fusion may be on the point of being energy recoverable, right? Energy positive. That's pretty exciting, and that again is one of those game-changing questions. You know, if we have the ability to produce some measurable fraction of the sun's total output toward the Earth at a given moment, then the question about scarcity of electricity resources drops immensely. And we can start imagining what to do by solving things with electric power, from heat requirements to all sorts of stuff that
Communication.
right communication to pulling other things than ammonia out of the atmosphere, all sorts of stuff powered by relatively cleanly generated electricity. You know, that could be a game changer for us right there, which we're beginning to imagine the effects of now. But I think, you know, the ultimate effects of even a technology just like that could be profound enough as to reorganize a society from the inside out, given that our imperatives could just change because of the changing nature of abundance and the questions of what is now scarce as opposed to what used to be.
Or what will be.
Exactly. Yeah, what's the new scarcity, right? Lithium wasn't that scarce before we were developing this much electronics and this many electric cars
Neither
with
was
lithium-ion batteries. Pardon me?
Neither was bird poop. So, the Ferengi.
Oh,
The Ferengi means foreigner in Farsi.
really?
Yeah. And
Very
apparently it was
interesting.
based on like Western merchants.
Huh. So their presentation as the sort of foreign merchant of a forbidding sort of order or a threatening kind of order is really apt. Wow, that's a deep cut, Star
Right?
Trek. Well done.
Good job, Star Trek.
Wow, that's cool.
So, the Ferengi are kind of like Adam Smith to the extreme. Greed is good, you know? That if you just embody pure greed and economics, it'll benefit everybody.
What I can see in a certain sense in their speech about the great material continuum, that there's a kind of flow and ebb and tide. There's a kind of understanding that would be like Adam Smith's invisible hand in there as well.
And you see, there are millions upon millions of worlds in the universe, each one filled with too much of one thing and not enough of another. And the great continuum flows through them all like a mighty river, from have to want and back again. And if we navigate the continuum with skill and grace, our ship will be filled with everything our hearts desire.
Now, it's likely, and it's at least questioned in Trekonomics, that the whole gold press latinum thing is likely just a Ferengi ploy to keep like galactic markets alive.
How so?
Because like, why would it have any value for anybody?
I thought the value was that it was unreplicatable.
But still, what? You can't use it for anything.
Oh, that's right. It doesn't really have any functional purpose, does it?
No.
Interesting.
Literally, the only thing it does is it can't be replicated.
And so the Ferengi have through a
So the
sophisticated
Ferengi
marketing
have,
campaign.
yeah, exactly, like created a demand around that
Right.
unreplicatability, but it still has no value.
But in a certain sense, I could see where a culture of experience and uniqueness and the sentimentality of property is of huge sway, that they would glom on to the notion of gold press latinum in interesting ways. Not that they'd necessarily want to acquire a whole lot of it, but that I can see humans having a kind of weird emotional relationship to gold press latinum.
In
as
like
well.
a historical money sort of sense.
Exactly, right? That it could be weirdly endearing that the Ferengi are
Because
doing
you
this
could
way.
argue that most of the galaxy has either returned to or just always stayed at the barter system.
Well, now, on the level of large governments, I think essentially barter may be part of what happens, right?
Like, you know, you see the deals with Quark. He's trading for Tula berries and he's offering up whatever he has, Tholian silks or whatever.
Sure.
So
And he ultimately aims to convert that into currency.
So it's kind of interesting how like a primitive form of economics is sort of also a future form of economics, or at least
I
the
think
most basic
yeah.
form of economics.
In a certain way, once you get out beyond a planetary economy, I would imagine some of the initial economic moves would be things like a kind of barter. You know, we have technologies you don't. You have some we don't. Let's trade. You know? And that'll be an initial moment of contact. Or here's our language, here's your language. Some of those moments of initial interchange can almost hardly avoid that sense of barter, which is that kind of primordial moment of recognition of value in a moment of exchange.
The Ferengi really much embody du commerce, which Thomas Paine, who, you know, your Bolian guy,
Indeed.
is familiar
Was
with.
the captain of the Bolian guy. That's right. He was
it-
captain of the USS Thomas Paine.
Exactly right. He said, if commerce were permitted to act to the universal extent it is capable, it would extirpate the system of war.
Yeah, and I mean,
It's very much what Quark says.
Sure,
essentially.
and I think it's important to
We
note
wouldn't go
for
to war with the Dominion. We'd make a deal with the Dominion.
True.
you know?
It's important to note for Thomas Paine that he is saying a lot of those things in the context of resistance to the British monarch. And our economic interests diverge so powerfully that there's no other way this is really going to happen because you're not going to relent.
What I found really interesting too is Manu Sadia frames DS9 as Quark's journey. Like he says, the show is basically the journey of Quark, and in a way the Ferengi.
Okay.
How they go from that sort of Adam Smith du commerce sort of society to basically, he says Keynesian social democrats, which is basically what they become under Rom.
In a certain sense, yeah. I mean, the Keynesian element, I'm not sure I absolutely see, other than I suppose they have a changing relation to currency in that sense. And AI, okay, oh no, fair enough. Actually, I can see that there. Yeah, okay, fair enough. But yeah, the profound change that Rom brings about, and particularly that Mugi, through Zek and Rom, brings about,
is the social aspect.
Is profound. Yeah, absolutely. The powerful argument she develops, having the lobes for business, though not visibly, of course, is that they're literally losing out on both half of their possible customers for things, but also half of the potential profiteers of Ferengi society.
Half of the brains, like
right?
the human aspect as well.
Exactly. You know, they're
free up
losing
as many
out
brains
on,
as you can.
On the number of people who could put their smarts toward generating profits, right? And I think Rom recognizes that really powerfully.
In Ferengi society, human society.
Absolutely, that sense of collaboration, of having
the
common
brains.
cause.
That's the new slogan.
A communal interest, even.
How many of you would buy Locutors of Trek Free the Brains t-shirt?
Do tell us. We'd love to know.
Give me a second here, Dave. So, sorry, that was just my 2 semesters kicking in. My lobes were tingling.
But no, I can see Sadia's point that one of the most important arcs in that show is
the Ferengi.
Is the Ferengi arc, for sure. Quark is one of the earliest characters we see in the entire series. And his staying is actually one of the most important questions of the first episode.
And so is Roms and Nogs.
Sure. Yeah.
And the Grand Nagus, really.
Absolutely.
Up front, he's just... And Cousin Gala. So
nothing's going to change
Gala.
Lek.
Or Lek.
Lek's going to eliminate.
Eliminate injustice.
Perhaps. If there's enough Latin in it.
Hey, Lek, have you ever thought of eliminating injustice?
Nope. Hasn't crossed my mind. How do you stab that?
They say it's more difficult than taking down a Jem'Hadar.
Oh,
really?
Oh, I've said it before and I'll say it again, but seeing them running through the hallways of Empok Nor is one of my favorite moments of Deep Space Nine. They go down the hallway. Oh, it's
Retreat.
so good. Run away!
Run away!
Yeah. Some Monty Python lover was helping frame that episode.
Well, Dave, I think we should wrap this up.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we've spent all our credit here.
So, on the back of everything we've spoken about this evening, is the Federation future more or less realistic to you?
Well,
what do you think needs to happen to make it happen?
I suppose the things we've got to think about are, as much as I would love 2063 April 5th to be a date that shall live in everyone's adulation.
We can't count on replicators or the Vulcans.
We can't count on replicators. We can't count on the Romulans.
The Vulcans.
That's true. Maybe we can count on the Romulans. You never know.
Why would we want the Romulans?
I don't know. Sorry. We can't count on the Vulcans.
Okay.
You're right.
The Romulans show up. Earth history's a lot different.
Yeah, it's way different.
We could do a whole episode on what would happen if First Contact was the Romulans.
That's a fascinating what-if question, actually.
That is, actually.
We got to do that.
We're coming back to that one.
But we can't expect... No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. No one expects the Vulcans. I think that has to be a rule.
Yeah.
So we have to ultimately look for the kind of values that are thrown forward into the future in this fiction and try and bring them into reality for ourselves. And I think there's a lot of ways to do that. You know, mass
like we've
organization.
done with some of the technologies from
Sure.
Trek.
I think in terms of social change, in terms of economic change, one of our best avenues right now is
to
probably
avoid sanctuary districts.
Well, yes, but also to draw on the example given us in the Bell riots.
Yeah.
That one of the thing that kicks
Wealth
off,
inequality is an issue.
Yes, and the thing that makes the huge mark is the riots, but also the statements of those people telling their stories on that screen from the office, right?
Yeah,
and
I was a plant manager, and then
they just
I have a family.
ditched me, right? Yeah. So those things, I think, are things we can learn from. We can move in directions that we need to, and bringing those values of rationality, of cherishing the emotional connections in our lives while not allowing our principles to be overcome by them, and allowing our appetites to have their sway within the bonds and bounds of a legitimate reason that's justified in its pursuit of whatever kinds of economic growth it feels are necessary. I think it is possible. The big question to me is, can we get under control the excess production of desire which currently governs our economies?
See,
that means that we can't stop doing the things we're doing, you know?
For me, I'm going to draw from recent X-Men comics.
Oh!
And the X-Men, of course, all live on Krakoa right now. And they have their own
Well, I think
laws.
they've recently moved to Mars, haven't they?
They're on Mars too. Yeah.
Starting to.
Anyway, Nightcrawler, one of my favorite characters, has recently come up with the mutant religion. But before that, even they had rules of Krakoa. Anyway, and the first rule, which I think is what we really need to embrace on Earth here, is respect this land. So first, we need to get the environment. Not even first, where I say Nightcrawler formed this X-Men religion. What he says respect this land also means is respect everyone and everything on it, of course.
Respect the lives.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Again, enshrined in the Federation Charter beautifully, right?
So I think we get the environment and our relationships with each other, figured out. And the rest is kind of easy, I think, is what this book really shows us, is that like the economic parts aren't the hard part. And we don't necessarily need the replicators. I mean, some sort of automation. Technology needs to advance, but it's not going to stop. Technology doesn't just like slow down.
It shows no evidence of doing so.
So like that part's not a problem. Like the inventions we need, the guano example, that would have seemed way crazier than the stuff we need to actually achieve this,
Let's see what you mean.
So, I'm pretty optimistic. We gotta get the environment under control.
We need to see this century out.
Don't make
somehow.
me tie myself to any trees or anything. Let's get her under control, and let's each other as well.
Yeah. In that sense, it envisions a kind of, you could call it a tamed capitalism. I think you could call it a thoroughly constituted communism. You could call it a bunch of things. But I think ultimately what we see is a state beyond the categories that we currently use to consider them. One that has learned lessons on a planet that it's now applying. And that planet could be Vulcan or Earth or wherever, but that are now being applied through the discovery of common cause of sort of existence and life to the foundation of a society at large that actually is purposely founded to provide abundantly for the flourishing and beneficence and well-being of all its citizens. And even the non-citizens that happen to be there, So I think, and maybe you knew this when you tuned in, that we ultimately have an optimistic view. Not that it's not going to take hard work, not that it's not going to take solidarity and
change.
Really changing the way that we do things, particularly around things like property and the accumulation thereof. But we can get there. We just have to say, engage. End transmission. Oh, dang. You know what?
What?
You always forget something.
Yeah, I know. I've been trying to figure out what I forgot.
You know what I forgot?
What?
My The Doctor Goes on Tour commemorative plate.
The operatic collection series?
Exactly.
Oh my god.
That normally sits right in my hard carry.
Where did you leave it?
Probably back in my quarters. Maybe in my office, actually. Oh, it's in my office, and now that Bolian guy's got it.
Or Quark has it.
Yeah, it could be. He did like that plate.
Oh, that Bolian guy.
The time I tried to have a session with him. Woo! That realm. Oh, jeez.
Well, we'll figure that out later. We'll call back to the station. Hopefully,
all right,
hopefully
fine.
somebody takes our call.
Yeah, this time.
Except for, right? Vic, maybe? I don't know.
Oh, yeah, Vic might take it. Hey, Pally.
Does he have a phone?
Yeah, he's got one of those...
Do we have phones? Does anyone have phones?
How do we talk to anyone in this thing?
Oh, no.
Oh, no! Oh,
Hey,
God.
maybe we were practicing.
All right, let's just concentrate. All right, here we go.
We have a tour.
Here we go.
All right.
Warp 3.4 to Galorndon Core. Ready. You ready?
Down, 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 down to Sandrine. You better keep it clean. You're walking in to an action scene. Regulars there. They don't go downtown, but they all know how to kick a hog on around. If you like bad apples, love a wormhole, get yourself down, get home away from home. Sandrine, you better treat her like a queen. Sandrine, you don't want to see her getting mean. Say where the nights all day. Been looking, but I can't seem to find my way. Do you know the way? Place I seek, where we can talk over drinks or dance cheek to cheek. It's been fun, but I got to run. Got a voyage and so it's at the control. forgot.
What was that?
My horgon!
This is a no Jamaharon zone.